Good morning for me. Good day to you, or good night, or whatever time of day it is. It's nice to be here again. It always intrigues me. If anybody had told me I would end up in the second half of my 80s still doing this sort of thing, I would have laughed, but I'm glad I am. And thank you, those of you who every now and again send me a little encouragement for my podcast of the wandering mind, I call it. But it is wandering in that I go down rabbit holes and come up somewhere else and never turns out quite as I wish. For those of you who might be new to this, I'm a retired professor. I was primarily first a physician, then I moved into cell physiology, ended up cross-appointed between biochemistry and pediatrics in the University of Ottawa. I also dabbled in teaching humanities, literature for physicians, and ethics. And then students got on my case and winkled me out of my ivory tower, and a new career started, which has been going on now for 30 years of wandering around the world, especially the States, where docs find ways to get me to do grand rounds without too much difficulty. And then people outside medicine picked up what I was doing, and this part of it has been relatively new. So that's who I am. My tongue is sharper than it should be, but it's getting less sharp with time. But if I get excited about something, I can put people down without even intending to. So if you can handle that, fine. Now, I want to talk today a bit more carefully about how we deal with the people who say the science is in, the disaster of COVID, for instance. So I hope you'll find that helpful, or at least stimulating, and I hope to get some feedback. So let's go. Last week I read on one website, Helen Dale, I forget which one it was, Substack probably, but she was talking about culture. She's a very smart woman from Australia who I think lives mainly in London now, a lawyer, and with a very sharp mind, and very upset with some of the nonsense that's going on, and particularly the way racism is bandied around all the while. Of course, you can't use the word without being a racist yourself, so it's a pretty pointless exercise. Race is a surrogate for other things. It shouldn't be, but it is, because correlation should never be assumed to be causal, but we do with this thing. And she's one of the people who gets very cross about this because it's intellectually indefensible. Amazingly, she doesn't quote Tom Sowell, so I don't know whether she's found him or not. She has a lot of interest in economics, and this particular Substack article was dealing with economics, amongst other things, and pointing out that when people talk about colonialization, they don't bother to do any history. First of all, colonies as we knew them in the 19th century and onwards were a new thing. Before that, you had empires. The Brits were the first of a different form of empire, if you like, or one of the first. But large empires were the way the world ran, especially in the Middle East. And they last for a while, and then they get beaten up, and another one takes over. Islam was one of those. It came out of the desert. Basically, if Muhammad existed, and we're not even sure about that, but somebody like him existed, and then it was sort of tarted up a couple of hundred years after his death, and it became, in my view, a political exercise, and that's falling apart at the moment. And one of the things, I think another woman that I like listening to, Melanie, I've forgotten her name, a Jewish woman, you'll find her in the same sort of milieu. She points out that the Muslim world, from Morocco all the way across through the stands to Pakistan, bought into the idea that Islam was the final revelation from God and was going to control the world forever. course, one of the questions you ask a radical Muslim straight away is, how come you haven't made it anything? And how come you don't want to live in a Muslim state? Those are perfectly valid questions and should always be asked. But their approach to other people who are not Muslims, they say, well, we offer you 3 reasonable things. You can convert, that's fine. Or you can not convert, and if you're a person of the book, you can pay the jizya. That's an incredibly high tax, so high that on average you had to sell every 4th child into slavery in order to pay the tax. But then they'd let you live your life to a degree. Or we'll cut your head off. Take your choice. And they think that's good enough. And of course, when they conquered other nations, and they were very good fighters, they conquered the Mediterranean basin in a century or so and got all the way into Spain and some way into France before they were turned back. But Muhammad, or the teachings of Islam, say when you fight a war, you kill anyone you want to, and you take slaves of whoever you want, and women who are not Muslims are fair game. Now, that ought to have been talked about in Britain. It shouldn't have needed somebody not that sophisticated to point out that Pakistanis in the north west of England were raping, grooming, alienated girls, and nothing was done about it. Disgraceful. And they had grooming gangs all over Britain. One of those 2 writers actually puts up the pictures of, we've got to that point now of almost 30 men who've been convicted of this sort of thing across Britain, all of whom are Muslim, because they actually have a word for non-Muslim girls, which basically says you can do what you like with them. Now, that's a culture, and it's not inappropriate to discuss it. Now, it's not actually compatible in its radical form with the Western world. And Trump, at some level, appears to appreciate this in a way that the liberals don't. And I want to talk about how we got to that state in a rather roundabout way. I talked in a previous podcast about the beginnings of science in the Western world, and I've got to find that podcast and listen to it because I know I didn't finish all that I wanted to say. So this is going to overlap with that one to a degree. But the important thing to understand is that science didn't begin way, way back. It didn't happen in any realistic way with the Greeks or with the Muslims. Mathematics happened. The Greeks did that well. Aristotle taught us logic, which is important, but he respected his own mind so much that he never even bothered to check his mind's idea that things fell in proportion to their weight. He only needed to go to the nearest cliff to find out that he was wrong, but he never did. And such was the power of his intellect that nobody questioned him. In fact, when Galileo made his telescope and showed it to some Jesuits, and they looked at the moon and saw the craters, which weren't supposed to be there, according to Aristotle, one of the Jesuits said, nothing that your machine, your thing shows us can undermine the thought of the divine Aristotle. What a thought. Of course, it did, in fact, in due course, undermine it. But there was one Muslim who attempted a serious approach experimentally, and it was unacceptable to the caliph of the time, or the local ruler, who wanted him to do something that he couldn't do, and you don't tell him you can't do it, so he had to feign madness until the boss died and he could get on with his life again. But he got very close to experimentally working out vision, but he wasn't appreciated by the Muslim environment. And most of the intellectuals went to Spain because that was the only place where Jews, Christians and Muslims talked to one another, especially intellectuals. And the mullahs were the other end of the Mediterranean, and for a long while They weren't even aware what was going on. What the Muslims did do very well when the church split, with the Greek-speaking bit going east and the Latin-speaking bit going west, the west was much more violent, tribal. Anybody coming from Mars and looking at Europe at 10th century or thereabout would have thought of Europe as going nowhere. Little fiefdoms always fighting one another for bits of territory. The East did better than that. But it turned out they were wrong, because Christianity was there and it had centuries to grow from the Augustinian start. Augustine didn't speak Greek, so the Latin West was dependent upon Augustine to a large degree, later worked on by Aquinas in the 13th century, 12th century. They believed the Christian story, and the priest, the bishop, could keep the king in order. The political rulers feared God. They did not want to be excommunicated. And as long as that persisted, that was a reasonable and good balance. But of course, eventually it broke down. And how did it break down? Well, the City of God provided the framework for the development of the Western world. And there was no printing press, of course. All documents had to be copied by hand, so there weren't that many. And the big change occurred as a result of the collapse of Rome, with the pagans coming in from the north and basically taking what they wanted and not realizing what they were destroying. But Benedict of that time, Saint Benedict, formed the monasteries, and within which civility, virtue, and learning could survive, and they did. Later, schools, as cities grew a little bit, began to form in the cities. So that was the only intellectual backdrop there was to the development of the Western world. And what happened was they took over the Greek ideas when they came back over the Pyrenees in around the 10th century. Once they hit Europe with that nearly 1,000 years, 1,000 years of Christianity, it found fertile soil, which it never found in Islam. They honored Aristotle. They did mathematics and astronomy. They were very good, incredible naked eye observers of the heavens. But they didn't do the other stuff. And it took off in Europe. Aquinas putting it all together in the most famous intellectual activity in 5 centuries since Augustine. And then the printing press. And once the scriptures were available to the ordinary mortal, especially at a time when several disreputable things like selling remission of sins by the church, the Catholic Church, was, questionable to say the least. And Luther was deeply upset by what he was reading and seeing the difference between the church. And with the coming of the Bible, particularly in the vernacular, Luther founded the Protestant Church. I don't know whether he intended to, or whether he intended to reform the Catholic Church. I don't know. But what happened is beyond any criticism. It did happen, and the world began to change in dramatic ways. Now, the structure of learning from the past was done in 4 categories. This is trivializing to a degree, but it's memorable, and it's not too far from it's a good starting point. They were called the 4 causes. In order to explain something, you needed to know what it was made of, the formal cause, the material cause. You needed to know what ideas went into it, the formal cause. You needed to know what skills went in, and you needed to know what it was for, purpose. Now, what happened was extraordinary. When all this learning came back, the universities lapped it up. Wow, now we have a structure for teaching. They just loved Aristotle and his deductive logic. He did teach us logic. But the universities that started to appear in the 12th century were under the control of the local bishop. And the Bishop of Paris was worried about what this new learning might do. It might undermine the faith of the humble poor. Education could do that, can't it? Some of you know that. Your children have gone off to university and they come back thinking you're foolish and without a faith. So he said, you can't do this new stuff till we've thought about it more. So they were banned from teaching deductive logic. But they weren't banned from teaching inductive logic. Aristotle knew about induction, but he didn't trust it because he didn't have the theological base that you need to trust inductive logic. But Christians do have a base because God is not an arbitrary God, not like Allah, who is unconstrained by anything. He does exactly what he wants. He's not constrained by logic or by any of those things. But God says he's taught his people throughout history that he's not like that. He is good, and he's the ultimate craftsman, if you like. Read Psalm 19 if you want to get this idea into your head. Teach it to your children so that they know it by heart. It might save their souls later on. Lewis called it the most brilliant poem of all time. Start with nature, move to metaphysics, the law, the Torah. Beautifully done. So, they were all Christian. That was the only game in town. And I think it went something like this. They would say, well, we have to obey the bishop. We don't have any option. But what are we going to do? Maybe we could do inductive reasoning. We were told that in the Bible that we were to be stewards of nature and to be in control of it. But we aren't. We've not made much progress, have we? Maybe we're doing it the wrong way. Syllogisms all the way down. It's a great display of intellectual ability, but it hadn't got them anywhere. So why don't we start empirically? They didn't call it empiricism, but they said, let's try doing simpler things and see if we can go in the reverse direction. So the first experiments were done in Merton College, Oxford, in the 14th century. And they drew the first graph without knowing what they'd done, and the whole thing took off. But it had a drawback. Only, I think, William of Ockham understood the drawback to begin with, and he's caused us some problems because what happened in Merton College then went to France, Oresme and Buridan, and then Descartes, and then back into England at the time of a very smart, unbelieving, but smart enough to not reveal his unbelief, Francis Bacon, changed the meaning of the word fact. Facts for the ancient world were moral facts. The Ten Commandments were factual because God spoke them. They were true. We don't think that way now, or most of us don't. So Bacon said, let's turn it upside down a bit. And he encouraged people to collect facts, by which he meant physical facts, things that could be measured. That's an incredible change. Newton didn't accept it. Newton was the last of the medievals. He still believed that moral facts are more important than physical facts. But very shortly, this new approach was very, very successful in material terms. It took off like a rocket on that long-standing Judeo-Christian base, foundation, norms. Within, no time flat. Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler. Kepler's the amazing one, in my view, in many respects. He had the toughest life, but he kept going. And he said, when he came up with his laws, he said, I didn't work that out. I saw it. It was a gift. And then he could show, yeah, it's true. And recalculated Tycho Brahe's data by hand for years before he got it right. Newton knew about it. There were probably only half a dozen people who could read Copernicus and Kepler, and Newton, of course, was one. And then he put it all together. Leibniz was close on his heels, but the world had changed. Nature and nature's laws lay hid in gloom, darkness. I've forgotten the poem exactly. Pope. God said, "Let Newton be," and there was light. A cynic later said, the devil said, "Let Einstein be," and everything was black as hell again. But Newton was a turning point, and he had a good run, several centuries before he was limited with Einstein coming along. But within 100 years of Newton, Laplace, a French Catholic physicist, was explaining science to Napoleon, and Napoleon said, "Where does God fit into all this?" And Laplace said, "I have no need of God to do science." That was arrogant, and it was ignorant. Yes, you don't need to acknowledge God to do science, of course not. There are empirical ways of looking at your measurements and repeating them, etc., etc. But not to recognize that it hadn't happened anywhere else for good reason. And that reason was, without a God who provided the ethical structure for life, it couldn't happen. Darwin can't provide a basis for ethics, and therefore cannot deal with the question, if I publish this paper, I will get a big grant, and they won't find out that I made up the data for at least 10 years. That's a reasonable trade-off. It'll probably be longer. That's what's happened. I'll talk about this at some later podcast, but the impossibility of reproducing scientific data nowadays, most papers cannot be reproduced because the average paper that's published is read by 6 people. It's not about science. It's about careers. It's about money. And that's undermining us, because the 4 causes, material, formal, efficient, and final, the final one being teleology, only 2 of them could be measured. So critically, teleology disappeared because you can't measure it. But you can't function without it. But for a long while, they just pretended. Well, they were keeping the bits they wanted, to keep life going, keep the church going, etc., etc. We even had a growing Protestant church with literacy growing, etc., etc. Lots of good things. The material change in the world in the last 200 years is unbelievable. Nobody could have predicted what was going to happen. It has been astonishing. Even in my lifetime, I mean, when I was growing up as a kid, we lived on $20 a week, and I didn't know we were poor because I wasn't poor. The children today, many of them are much poorer because I had utterly committed parents who were loving, who gave 10% of their salary to the Lord's work before they took anything themselves, never went into debt. I was fed, I was watered, I was clothed, and I was encouraged. How many children have that today? What's the probability that a 14-year-old will have both parents around together? Not very high. We're falling apart in that sense. But that's not the only way. So, the beginnings of science, people had an ethical framework that was given, that was enculturated. And ordinary people didn't bother with learning how to argue it through. They had a practical way. They didn't ask, what's the ethical solution to our argument? They said, what's reasonable? And what was reasonable was what the Bible said. So if one side could say, oh, the Bible says this, the other guy said, I suppose, yeah. Let's get on with it, life. That's the way it worked. It made sport possible in many ways. I was fascinated not so long ago to read Beyond the Boundary, an account by C.L.R. James of his growing up in Trinidad. And he said, we cheated in school, but we never cheated at cricket. That's the amazing thing about that game. If you cheat, you become known as a cheat, and you will pay for it in various ways. But that's what they got from learning this strange English game. It makes a difference. Tom Sowell has pointed out that the black community that was born and brought up in the Caribbean does better than the black community that was born and brought up in the USA. It's a complex issue, but it's an interesting comment. But purpose was provided by the story. There were ways to live, and that gave you a structure to your life. But God has his ironic revenge, of course, because as science progressed, the bit that I know best, of course, is the biochemical area. In 1953, I was 13, so I didn't know what was happening in Cambridge, when Watson and Crick got the structure of DNA. And I'm told it was a physicist who actually said that's a code. Because it was. Crick eventually managed to take the credit for that himself, but I don't believe it was actually him. He publicized it, and that's worthwhile. But you see, once you got DNA as a structure, it didn't tell you what it does. But you can't help asking the question, what's it for? It's in every living cell. What does it do? Well, some viruses only have RNA, but in every nucleated cell. Astonishing phenomenon. You can't escape from teleology. What's it for? Of course, the next thing, you get a protein, and it's a linear thing in the scientist's mind, but then they have to start dealing with it at another level, which was what Rosalind did, but didn't realize what she'd done with DNA, which is to get the three-dimensional structure. And my goodness, it looked like a mess. In the three-dimensional structure of proteins, it takes some learning to see its beauties. It took time. They are there. God loves shape. Oh, and how precisely is it shaped for particular purposes? Lock and key. Yeah, it's astonishing. So gradually we made progress, but the progress is overwhelming. The wow factor is astonishing. You can't do this sort of stuff and not be overwhelmed by it at some level unless you're entirely without any imaginative functions. The probability of DNA as a 4-letter, 3 letters per word, billion letters are in a row, and they can be copied in a few seconds with a checking system to see there aren't too many faults, and even the faults that are allowed probably matter, but that's another story. This is incredible. And those people who are honest enough and have the imagination bend the knee in the end. Honest biologists know that the probability of simple Darwinianism producing DNA is zero. Absolutely zero. It's not possible. The probability of getting from inorganic to organic is actually even worse. So those two groups are, they just don't want to discuss it anymore if they don't believe, but they're leaving the believers alone now because it's not unreasonable. Purpose at the heart of biochemistry. That's quite amazing. Now, I've already spent far too much time on this, but that's all right. We've got years ahead of us, I hope, God willing. But I want to teach you one wonderful little way to open this up. I mentioned my experience in Cuba in a previous podcast somewhere, and that was wonderful. But my favorite example is from Donald Mackay, who I had the privilege of listening to as a student when he was at King's in London, and I was there. And I wasn't yet able to handle what he was saying, but I realized this is very good. And he has a lovely analogy, which any honest person who thinks they understand that you don't need God is set back on their heels if they're honest. He says, I want you to imagine that two friends go on holiday together. One is a traditional Christian and the other is an atheist, and they both do the same sort of science. They're both very reductive modern scientists doing empirical approaches with experiments. And one of them, of course, is such a nut in that direction that he carries a small laboratory around him for the purposes of this illustration. And they're sitting on a cliff one night looking out to sea, and a light starts to flash near the horizon. And the scientist says, that's fun. Let's find out what we can about it. And he gets his stuff out and he starts producing data. He says, well, it's a sodium source. It's flashing with the following frequencies. And he produced a whole raft of perfectly correct data. Meanwhile, the other guy, the Christian one, says, years ago, I knew the Morse code. And he manages to get enough of it to realize that the flashing light is saying, the bit of cliff you're sitting on is about to crumble into the sea. Get off. The science could never get to that without the code. And the code had to be written by an intelligence. It makes much, much more sense to think that there is an intelligence behind the universe rather than emptiness. Even the most atheistic of people has to say, well, you have to give me one miracle, which is, of course, the Big Bang. The probability of it happening by chance. And what was before it? In the beginning, the matter? No. Oh, in the beginning, mind? Well, it's one of the two, isn't it? And, of course, who was it now? I've forgotten his name at the moment. Well-known physicist Nagel was an atheistic physicist, and he came to the conclusion that no, it looks as though there's a mind behind the universe, and he wrote a book about it, and he got slammed on Arts and Letters Daily for ages. But he's not alone. There are lots of people now who are moving at the higher levels of the university, the ones who still have some intellectual integrity. They're saying, well, looks as though there may be a God. So learn that little parable, teach it to your children. It's how to think about scientific reductionism and see that it has limitations. If you can find Donald Mackay's little book, The Clockwork Image, which was published in 1973, it would be a lovely read. I will say more about it in a future video. The start of this, of course, was Helen Dale, and what she was pointing out was that the empires of the past were brutal, but the colonialization by the Western powers was done on purpose, for a purpose, and they brought their culture with them. And that culture included literacy, a legal system, roads, railways. They left things behind that made a difference. Mangalwadi, the Indian guy, has written, who was a Hindu and became a Christian as he thought about these things, and has written a book called about the Bible called The Book That Made the West Possible. That's not exactly the correct title, but it's close enough. You'll find him. And he describes his own journey. Now, the anti-colonialists, instead of blaming colonization and saying, well, we would have done it ourselves if you hadn't come and enslaved us. No, that's just a lie, isn't it? Because, as Tom Sowell points out, sub-Saharan Africa was always a slave environment. Africa has the most slaves today, and the brutally organized fighters like the Zulus, the Maasai, the dominant tribes, they packed off the others. They sold them as slaves. Nobody from the West collected the slaves from the interior of Africa, because in those days, even going ashore was dangerous. The death rate amongst the crew was the same as amongst the slaves, but the crew died from malaria. The slaves died from maltreatment. It was bad. But it did make other things possible. That needs to be faced. Just acknowledging that you can't use racism as a cause without being racist. So why don't we look at the empirical data? There's much that was done wrong, but if you're going to talk about paying people who were enslaved, the Americans have got a big case to make, because they had to spend a lot of money stopping the white slave trade in North Africa. So all the European nations, the Muslims captured slaves and sold them, and they didn't stop slavery till the 20th century, and then only under pressure from outside. So a little more history is important. Tom Sowell deals with it honestly, and being black, they have a problem. They have to deal with him honestly too. So, a few things to read. Have a good week.